Welcome to Around the Weird. Here's your host, the museum curator of the strange and unusual, Mr. Nothing.
Thank you, mysterious voice, and welcome back to Around the Weird, a booktube channel where I talk about all of the unusual and out of the ordinary literature that I have found in my travels, and sometimes I do a book tag like today. So I was tagged by Lucas over at the Bits of Lit, or the Bit of Lit, or something about lit, to do the Western Canon book tag, which is essentially picking 20 books that the person making the video would choose to represent the must-read literature in Western civilization. And I think I've picked about 20 books that I think would be a good fit. Lucas also picked 20 interesting books that I'm going to link to, or I'm going to link to his video in the description so that you can find his video as well. I agree with a lot of his choices, and I changed some of my answers just so we weren't on the same wavelength, because that would have been just a repetitive video. But I also disagreed with him in some regards. As I was writing it out while listening to his video, I was just shaking my head sometimes. But nothing too unusual, I would say, from his selections. But yeah, I think I'll go tag whoever is listening in this video. One of the people at the Codex Cantina, Una or Crypto, if they haven't already done this, I'm sure they have. Tell me, what your 20 books for the Western canon, to represent the Western canon would be. I would love to hear from everyone about this, just because it'd be interesting to see if there's any unusual answers or if there's something in common with all the answers. I'm sure there will be. But yeah, I managed to choose some poems, some books. I tried to find a short story here and there, but I couldn't find one that really fit with the Western canon, unless it was something by Edgar Allan Poe, and I thought that was a bit obvious, and so maybe somewhere there's room for Poe in the Western canon, but I don't see any room for him on my top 20 list. And I should also note that I chose books kind of based on their impact and reach, and there are some books on here that I don't necessarily agree with. Maybe I wasn't as big a fan of them as I thought I'd be, and I don't necessarily see it being that great in my eyes, but its impact and its reach in Western civilization is huge, and that's why it's on the list, which I feel is a good measure of anything. Just because it's not good, or just because it's not as good as something else, doesn't mean it's not important in some way. Remember, there's no points for being the best. It's just there's a lot of points for being the most remembered, or something like that. So anyway, without further ado, let's talk about these 20 books. I will just recite them off right here, and then we'll move on from there. So number 1 on my list is Beowulf by Anonymous, which it doesn't really have an author, and so. I really selected it because I think it's a good piece of European literature. It's one of the earliest pieces of European literature in general, from around the year 900 or so. And it tells a classic adventure tale that many people have borrowed, and is still it's a story that's still told to this day. So you can see that it's memorable and it's influential in a lot of ways. And then number 2 is Don Quixote by Miguel de Cervantes, which again, it's another influential kind of story being passed down through the generations, and also being the subject of a lot of our common phrases, like tilting at windmills, or something like that, where we just borrowed a lot of phrases from it. And I feel like that's much like with Beowulf. It's a good indicator that if it has a lasting influence, it belongs somewhere in the Western canon. So I think that's another good pick right there. And of course, number 3, we have to have some Shakespeare on this list just because Shakespeare is influential and has had a big impact in terms of, his poetry, the sonnets he wrote, and the plays he wrote, which have been adapted and rewritten and turned into a bunch of other things. And one of them is, of course, Hamlet, which it's not necessarily my favorite Shakespeare play, but I do consider it to be one of the most important, just because of the story and the power of like someone trying to get vengeance for their father, and how Disney basically stole the story for The Lion King. And you can see the kind of influences it's had in the culture, and it's still taught in high school English classes to this day, which is why you'll see it in the Western canon. Number 4 is The Legend of Sleepy Hollow by Washington Irving. I feel like this is going to be a bit of a controversial pick, but my reasoning for this is because Washington Irving, a lot of his writing was about myth making, like building up the legend, the folklore of America. And you see that especially with The Legend of Sleepy Hollow, talking about like small towns in the 1700s, the legends that carried over from Europe. And he was telling a spooky story at the same time, a ghost story essentially. And I feel like all of those were kind of passed down from Europe and borrowed and sort of morphed into something all of its own. And so if I had to pick one of Washington Irving's stories, it would probably be this, although you could probably say the short story collection that this is based on could also be part of the canon. Number 5 is Frankenstein by Mary Shelley, a classic tale of monster woes, and also one of the first Gothic stories. And you can see the influence that it has had even to this present day with the horror that we're seeing in books and movies and TV shows. And a lot of it has to do with Frankenstein, with the idea of a mad scientist or something being risen up from the dead, or even the idea of the monster gone, your hubris leading to like your own creation turning against you, or something like that. I feel like that story has a massive impact in Western civilization, and we're still basing stories off of it. Even in Eastern civilization, with Frankenstein in Baghdad, which was a pretty solid story that I read over the spring. Number 6, I did mention there would be a poem or some more poems on this list, and I'm going to include all of Emily Dickinson's poems in the Western canon. Emily Dickinson's poems are very strange, and although she didn't get them published until after her death, I feel like her poetry influenced like a lot of poets, especially in Western culture, for decades. For years, and including to the present day. And I can really see, because I do Poetry Thursday videos, and I see a lot of people borrow from her style in terms of themes, in terms of her sort of unconventional subject matter. It's definitely had a lasting impact, and so I think it belongs on this list. And then number 7, I think Lucas also had it on his list, is Moby Dick by Herman Melville. It's just really like hard not to see this as massively influential and far-reaching. I think a lot of stories that came after, like even though Melville was criticized at the time for his writing, and he largely died without being considered a popular or even well-regarded author, like after his death, like people rediscovered his work and found out, wow, this is actually pretty interesting, although the dude loved to write about whales. And you see that a lot with Moby Dick, and Moby Dick, I feel, kind of influenced the structure and format of like these journey tales, these stories of journeys, and these these stories of hubris that you see in Ahab, and just following specific people around. I feel like that was kind of influential and guided how people write stories in the future. And even what we're seeing now. So, and even if that wasn't enough to, let you know that it was influential, it's still being made into movies and adapted on TV. So, clearly Western civilization has like a fondness for this story. Number 8 is, again, I don't necessarily agree that everything on this list is great, but I will say The Adventures of Huckleberry Finn by Mark Twain certainly belongs in the Western canon. It's a simple story about a boy traveling down the Mississippi River with his slave, but it the impact that it's had on sort of the road tripping kind of story. And where people get into shenanigans, I can see it being very influential for young adult fiction as well. But more so than that, like the impact it's had in schools, because again, like this was taught in my high school to me, and it's taught in many high schools around around the world, really in Western civilization. So I do think it's kind of influential in that way, and enough so that I feel like it has to be included in the Western canon, even if I don't necessarily think Mark Twain is that great of a writer. Again, it doesn't matter if you're like super great. It only matters if people like talk about you, I suppose. And then number 9 is Invisible Man by Ralph Ellison. So I actually really enjoyed reading this book. I thought it was a pretty realistic depiction of how black men or how black individuals are treated in America, and to see this black man go from like a place where he's ready to see the world to a place where he's so angry and upset and wants to just the world to go away and leave him alone and stop being so discriminatory and hurting people like him and people who look like him. I thought it was a really powerful story, and I do think at the time that it came out, it was a very necessary story to hear. Even still now, like it's still important to hear. But it came out at the right moment in American history, as it was right around the American civil rights movements of the 1950s and 60s. And because of that, like it belongs in the Western canon, but also because of its high quality, it belongs in the Western canon. Another story that I believe belongs on this list, along the same lines of Black liberation, is Beloved by Toni Morrison. It's a story about a former slave who tries to go about her life, but she's haunted by her past, and she's also haunted by a ghost. I thought it was a pretty solid book, but more so than that, I think it tells a realistic depiction of the effects of slavery that I feel we should capture, or needs to be captured and captured for posterity and in the Western canon. Like it's in addition to books that are high quality and just generally fun to read and stuff like that, you should also have books that are historically important in the Western canon, like capturing moments in time that our culture, needs to talk about, needs to address, and can't just gloss over. And I think Toni Morrison does a really good job of doing that. Number 11 is All Quiet on the Western Front. It is a book about World War I and the effects on the soldiers who fought it. A very terrifying depiction of poison gas and trench warfare that leaves the main character and their friends like dead or injured. A very, very sad book, but also possibly one of the best war depictions I've read in a book. And again, capturing important moments in history and the impact of the book. I believe that All Quiet on the Western Front has a place in, at least in my version of the Western canon, like it has a place there. Number 12 is a bit of an indulgence on my part. It is East of Eden by John Steinbeck, a pretty solid generational story about the Trask family through generations as they try to deal with the burdens that the fathers place on the sons and the fighting that goes on between the sons. It is a wonderful like religious work. It's a wonderful like family work. There's a lot to explore there, and I think it's the height of John Steinbeck's work, and it also captures family relations and life in California as he typically wrote about, and it's something worth preserving, and I think capturing in the Western canon. You could also have said like Grapes of Wrath or Of Mice and Men, and I feel like those stories might be more influential in some ways, but I feel like East of Eden is his better work. And although I said like better doesn't always necessarily mean most memorable, in this case I can't pass over East of Eden so easily. I feel like it has to be in the Western canon somewhere. Number 13 is another indulgence on my part. It is Stoner by John Williams. This is a bit of an interesting one for me because like at the time that he wrote it, like not a lot of people talked about John Williams or the book Stoner. But in like the 50 or 60 years that have passed since it's been written, more people have started talking about it. And I wouldn't necessarily call it influential, but I do think it is a powerful work that is worth talking about. As it relates to, the ordinary lives that everyone leads. Because the character of Stoner isn't like some, highfalutin, adventuring kind of man. He's just a teacher in higher education. He lives a very plain and simple life. He's dealing with some struggles, but for the most part, he's a very boring man. But there, as John Williams is pointing out, like there's beauty in the mundanity, and I think that that is what makes this book really powerful and makes it have a spot in my version of the Western canon. Number 14 is 1984 by George Orwell, a very important piece for catalog or for highlighting what modern America looks like, or at least the America of now, a very specific point in time, highlighting the ills of authoritarianism and what surveillance can lead to when a government doesn't trust its people. And when people grab for large amounts of power, just something worth preserving in the Western canon, because there's always going to be those people who are don't read these kinds of books, or that they're going to try to be authoritarian towards you, and they're going to try to take away your rights. And 1984 is always a good reminder of how that happens. Number 15 is the Communist Manifesto. Although I do think socialism is pretty groovy, that is not the reason I put it on this list. With the Western civilization struggle with workers' rights and really fighting the oppression of the ruling classes is, especially since the 1800s, is something that's been so ingrained in our society and so enmeshed that it's often difficult to separate Western civilization from this struggle for workers' rights and equality for all. And what better way to enmesh that into the Western canon than with one of the people who first began talking about it, Karl Marx, and in the Communist Manifesto. So I think that's worth preserving in that regard. Number 16 is The Ones Who Walk Away from Omelas by Ursula K. Le Guin. I don't necessarily think it's Le Guin's best work. I think that is kind of reserved for the Wizard of Earthsea right now. But The Ones Who Walk Away from Omelas has a powerful message about complacency and suffering, and systems that promote suffering, and how not every utopia is necessarily a utopia for everyone in it. A lot of very necessary messages to hear, which is especially important when any society has a lot of people who view themselves as well off and has an underclass, and those people don't really examine that underclass too closely and think about how they got to be in a point where they're not really suffering. And so the Ones Who Walk Away from Omelas, I just feel deserves a place in the Western canon, especially in the section where the books are more recent. Number 17 is Mouse. Lucas at the Bits of Lit chose Watchmen as his comic book representation, and I couldn't really think of any comic book in particular. Like, Watchmen's a pretty good choice. V for Vendetta 2, Alan Moore is a great writer, possibly one of the best comic writers around, alongside Neil Gaiman, of course. But Mouse is a pretty good representation of both graphic novels, comic books, and also an in-depth study of the Holocaust and how the long-term effects of the Holocaust on, the people who dealt with it and the next generation. So I think Mouse is worth preserving in the Western canon, in my version of it, just because it talks about another one of those uncomfortable moments that we don't like to address in human history. And then number 18 is one that people aren't really going to like. It's Harry Potter and the Sorcerer's Stone by J.K. Rowling. I know J.K. Rowling is a terrible human being, and Harry Potter and the Sorcerer's Stone isn't really that great of a book. Like, even from a young adult fiction standpoint, it doesn't really, do anything too special, and yet it still has a very big place in our culture. It was very influential in terms of, copycats and the whole sequelization of young adult fiction, influencing, I'd say, the Percy Jackson series, I'd say influencing Twilight, the Hunger Games, and also contributing to Hollywood's obsession with sequelization as well. So even though the book isn't that really standoutish in terms of its writing, the impact that it's had means that it has a place in the Western literary canon. It's just we got to make sure to exclude J.K. Rowling from this and make it so that this book doesn't really have an author paired with it, so that we don't preserve a bigot in the long term. Number 19 is The Catcher in the Rye by Salinger. I think this book is actually, it's kind of like Stoner, in that it's like a modern classic, that although Catcher in the Rye got its due when it came out, a lot of people viewed it as, or it's well regarded, people appreciated it in its time. And I do think that what the book is, what Salinger wrote about, how the lost generation and the idea that even though it's post-war America and things are supposed to be going great, there's the feeling that, awful things have happened in the recent past, and it's hard to get over that. And so Catcher in the Rye is, a really seminal piece for post-war America, for post-war Western civilization. And I think it's important to catalog it into the Western canon so that we can preserve a story like that. And then the last one, number 20, is Fahrenheit 451, a book about authoritarianism and book burning, especially when given throughout many periods of history. Book burning has always been a fascination or a necessity by the people in power, who view it as a way of controlling the population. I agree with a lot of what Ray Bradbury said in here, although he didn't necessarily say, he didn't want to say anything about like book burning or authoritarianism. He had a completely different message, which I think is kind of stupid. But if, death of author, it happens all the time. And I still think that Fahrenheit 451 should be preserved in the Western canon, especially because we've also preserved 1984, and those are similar ideas there. And just preserving those kind of ideas help us fight against the fascists and the authoritarians in the future. Anyway, those are my thoughts on the Western canon book tag. Again, I'm tagging the boys at the Codex Cantina, and while I don't necessarily think all these books are the best, they're just simply the most memorable, the most impactful, and I also don't necessarily think there should be a Western canon. It doesn't really make sense to me, especially given that, each society over each generation values something different. So while one generation might like a certain number of books, like the next generation isn't going to like the same books. That's especially been true like throughout American history, where some people have said, "Oh, Poe is great," and then years later they're like, "No, Poe is bad," and then he's back in vogue and then he's out in vogue. It really shifts constantly as our tastes change through time. So it's really difficult to establish a strict canon. There's only a temporary canon that we're all talking about right now. If you disagree with this, or you simply want to comment on a book I've said here, or suggest another book that might be worthy of the canon, let me know. And in the comments below, let's have a discussion about this. Otherwise, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe so that more people can find out about this channel and these my Western canon ideas if they want to learn about them. And until then, I wish you the best of luck in your weird and Western travels. Farewell.